A racist director slaps a black teenager on a plane, but just seconds later, an elderly man stands up and changes everything. The sharp sound echoed, the sound of a hand striking someone's face, loud and sharp like thunder, breaking the silence of the plane's cabin. In that instant, all noise seemed to vanish, and the 237 passengers in the cabin froze, caught in the same intense shock as the dry, hollow sound reverberated through the aircraft soaring 36,000 feet above the ground. Marcus Williams, a 16-year-old black teenager and the son of the FAA administrator, was slapped directly in the face by a middle-aged white man, Warren Caldwell, right in the middle of the crowded passenger cabin. The boy's head jerked to one side from the force of the slap, his left cheek turning bright red, his eyes wide open in shock and humiliation. One by one, eyes and heads turned toward row 16, where the nightmare had just begun. 237 passengers were silent, none of them daring to say a word. Warren Caldwell, his face as red as wine, stood over Marcus, his trembling index finger pointing directly at him, still filled with rage. "I told you to know your place, boy." The racist words hung in the air, like poisonous smoke spreading quickly through the cabin. The people around, mostly white, some of color, stood frozen, like wax figures. A few phones were raised, but no one dared to intervene. The flight attendants were still far off, unable to reach the scene in time. Marcus said nothing. He didn't cry, scream, or resist. He just sat there, maintaining the quiet pride of someone who had grown too familiar with situations like this. But not here. Not in this sealed airplane at an altitude of over 10,000 meters, where every gaze felt like a razor-sharp blade. The atmosphere was tense, like a taut string, stretched to its limits, just waiting for the slightest touch to snap. And then, from row 23, an elderly man slowly stood up. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't shouting, wasn't rushing toward the scene in panic. He simply stood. But his silence spoke louder than any words. His hair was graying, his face weathered by hardship, with eyes deep and filled with an unspoken sorrow. His stature wasn't tall, but he stood firm, like an ancient oak, a man you'd pass by hundreds of times in life without a second thought, but today no one could take their eyes off him. A flight attendant's voice came from behind. "Sir, please remain seated. Passengers are required to stay in their seats while the plane is—" But the man interrupted her in a voice that wasn't loud, but resonated like a bell ringing in the night. "I can't do that, not this time." No one knew who he was, no one understood what he was about to do, but in that moment, the entire cabin seemed to become a stage where history, memory, and justice were about to intersect. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him, toward Marcus, and toward the man who had just slapped a child in the sky. No one could have guessed that the next 17 minutes would change the fates of 3 people, Marcus, Caldwell, and the stranger who had stood up, forever. As the elderly man stepped forward, all eyes were on him. But in the middle of the cabin, Marcus remained seated, straight-backed, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands gripping his knees tightly. Not a single tear, not a word of complaint, only a cold silence, that of someone all too familiar with injustice, but it still hurt as if it were the first time. Marcus Williams, 16 years old, a senior in high school, was the only son of Charles Williams, the FAA administrator. To the public, Charles Williams was the ideal figure, dignified, decisive, and visionary. But to Marcus he was a father who was so strict he was almost cold, always demanding absolute perfection, always treating excellence not as something praiseworthy, but as an obligation. Since childhood, Marcus had lived between 2 opposing worlds. One was the glow of his father's powerful position, where white people smiled and exchanged pleasantries but always with a controlling gaze. The other was the black community, where every small achievement had to be earned with double the effort. He was the child who always had to tread carefully, speak just the right amount, smile just enough, because a single mistake could cause everything to crumble. This year's National Science Decathlon wasn't just a test. It was an opportunity, a ticket to prove to his father that, I don't need to follow in your footsteps. I can still create my own summit, through science, through intellect, through myself. His chosen topic was gravitational waves produced by a binary black hole collision, a field of modern astrophysics far beyond his years. Marcus wasn't just good, he was exceptional. But that exceptional always came with the unspoken undertone of, oh, impressive, for a black kid. Back to Warren Caldwell, the man who slapped Marcus in the cabin. His face was now hard, torn between anger, fear, and wounded pride. He was not a jobless thug or an uneducated brute. On the contrary, Caldwell was a senior executive at a global financial corporation, accustomed to traveling in business class, used to being prioritized and served. He lived in a bubble where his voice mattered, his gaze had power, and the social order had to be protected from people like Marcus, kids whom he thought were being given too many privileges by political correctness. He was used to smiling at black people at conferences, but never allowing them to sit at the same table as him. To Caldwell, Marcus embodied a change he couldn't control. Those black kids in hoodies who spoke like Harvard professors. Those brown-haired girls reading Dune who dared to laugh at his sharp words. The slap he delivered to Marcus's face, with all its aggression and humiliation, wasn't just because of an accidental elbow. It was the action of someone trying to hold on to an old world that was cracking. And in the midst of it all, Marcus, with his black backpack and simple gray hoodie, his left cheek still burning, carried not just a physical wound, but a deeper, more painful ache. That no matter who you are, no matter that your father runs the skies, there will always be people who think you don't belong here. And there will always be people willing to raise their hand, to strike you in front of hundreds. In the next 17 minutes, he would have to decide silence or stand up. And who was this elderly man who just stepped forward like a figure from the past? And why was he looking at Marcus as though he knew exactly what he was doing? Outside, the sky was still blue, but inside the cabin, a storm of emotions was about to break. Marcus still vividly remembered the moment 6 hours ago, right at Gate C-42 of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, when his father gripped his shoulder tightly, for the third time in a row, asking, "Are you sure you've backed up all your files? On the USB in the cloud, emailed to Professor Diaz?" The question wasn't out of mistrust, but a familiar expression of the quiet anxiety his father, Charles Williams, the FAA administrator, always concealed beneath his cold, stern exterior. Beneath his well-tailored suit, beneath the clear, precise voice of someone who had once overseen the entire U.S. air traffic control system, was a father still learning how to express love, through checklists, reminders, and quiet nods. Marcus smiled softly as he replied, "I've checked everything, Dad." 3 times. His father sighed, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze softening for a brief moment. "You know I'm proud of you, right? Not just because of the competition, but because you've stood strong, even though your mother, even though she's no longer here." That was the void Marcus couldn't put into words. His mother, a comparative literature professor, had left Atlanta nearly a year ago for a short-term research trip to Paris, but that trip never ended, and she never came back. In the dinners that were just the two of them, silence hung thick like fog. His father worked late into the night. Marcus cooked for himself, studied on his own, filling the empty spaces in the house and in his heart. So when Marcus walked into the boarding area, he didn't just carry his backpack with a laptop, a project presentation, and the national team's badge. He also carried his father's silent expectations, the emptiness from his mother's absence, and the weight of being a black teenager stepping into a space where he knew he would be looked at differently, from every glance to every breath. Meanwhile, in another part of the airport, Warren Caldwell was answering a call. "The meeting with the Oversight Committee will start as soon as I land. I want every presentation perfectly aligned. Yes, every slide. And cut the part about diversity. No one cares about that stuff anymore." His voice was curt, cold, and authoritative, the kind of tone someone who had grown accustomed to controlling others without raising his voice could use. Warren was the type of man who could silence a room with a mere glance, someone whom HR feared more than the board of directors. But what he hated most was change. He believed every minority support program, every scholarship for equality, every progressive policy was just a way for unworthy people to take his seat. And today, he had no idea that this flight, this very seat he would occupy, would bring him face to face with the very fear he always tried to avoid. A new generation growing up, intelligent, strong, and not like him. A few minutes later, Marcus passed through the ticket checkpoint. Before him was a narrow corridor leading to the plane's body, long, curved, like a tunnel leading into a closed world. He didn't know that he was about to embark on a journey not just across distance, but of human nature itself. A journey that would test the calm he had learned to survive with. A journey that would push the lessons, the words his father had taught him, the years of enduring and striving, to their very limit. The cabin door opened. Marcus Williams, a 16-year-old black student, wearing a hoodie, carrying the dream of reaching the stars, stepped onto the plane. Inside, Warren Caldwell sat in seat 16C, his head bent over his tablet screen, his eyes not yet looking up, but the collision between two worlds, two ideologies, two symbols, had already begun. As Marcus stepped through the threshold into the cabin, he accidentally brushed lightly against the shoulder of a man standing in front, checking his boarding pass. The man wore a pricey light gray suit, a glistening Swiss watch on his wrist, and eyes, cold as stainless steel. Warren Caldwell turned around, his scrutinizing gaze sweeping from the simple sneakers to the heavy backpack, up to the gray hoodie and the distinctly African features of the young teenager. "Watch it, kid," his voice sharpened, laced with a mocking, suggestive smile. "First time flying?" Marcus recognized that voice. It wasn't the voice of any particular person, but the tone, the condescension disguised as politeness, the kind he had heard throughout his years at elite private schools, the way adults would call him young man, but their eyes said, "You don't belong here." He took a deep breath, instinctively slipping into a practiced reflex from his youth, the Harvard interview voice. "No, sir, I just momentarily lost focus. My sincere apologies for the inconvenience." Warren raised an eyebrow, surprised, slightly uncomfortable. He didn't say anything more, just nodded indifferently and turned away. But Marcus had noticed the subtle shift, the change in the gaze, the look people give him when they realize he doesn't behave like their stereotype of him. In that moment, Marcus felt the protective shell he always had to wear. The polished language, the straight posture, the confident gaze, fully activated. Not to show off, but to protect himself from the quiet, venomous biases, the looks, the laughter, the sidelong glances from those who believed they were naturally above him in society. He recalled his father's words. "You're not allowed to make mistakes, Marcus. Others can mess up, but not you. As a black man, you always have to be precise, from the words you speak, to how you sit, to every step you take." Caldwell moved ahead into the cabin, greeted by the flight attendant's professional smile. He didn't look at anyone, merely nodded, as though he were entering his own private office. Marcus followed behind, his eyes sharp, but his heart heavy. He didn't know that the man, with that seemingly harmless question, would challenge his patience, dignity, and deepest beliefs in ways he never anticipated. Behind them, row 16 awaited the three of them to step into an invisible trial: Marcus, Sophie, and Warren Caldwell. In that moment, 3 generations, 3 social backgrounds, 3 perspectives were about to collide, not with guns or fists, but with glances, words, and attitudes, the sharpest weapons in the civilized world. And Marcus, the boy in the hoodie carrying the Williams name, had begun to face the first force in his journey to define his true worth. The cabin door closed behind Marcus. He moved into the middle row of the plane as though stepping into a battlefield, where each passenger was a piece of society compressed into the steel tube soaring through the clouds. Row 16 appeared. The middle seat, 16B, was Marcus's seat. In the window seat, 16A, sat a young woman around his age, her brown hair falling softly over her shoulders, intently reading Dune. In the aisle seat, 16C, was none other than Warren Caldwell, the man in the gray suit from earlier, now buried in his tablet, the screen's glow reflecting off his stiff, steel-like cheekbones. "Excuse me, I need to get to the middle," Marcus spoke softly, maintaining politeness in every syllable. Caldwell looked up. A flash of recognition crossed his eyes, followed by an unmistakable emotion: disappointment, tension, disdain. He sighed. The movement of standing up to give way appeared deliberately uncomfortable, his shoulders twisting sharply, stepping backward into the aisle as if having to sacrifice the whole world to do so. No one spoke, but the contempt radiating from his body language needed no words. "I was hoping you'd sit in another section," Caldwell muttered, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus didn't respond, didn't react. He only nodded slightly, as if he were all too familiar with this type of unspoken interaction, the kind of interaction that didn't have a name, but cut into the heart like a quiet knife. Sophie, the girl in the aisle seat, looked up and met Marcus's gaze. She smiled gently, sincerely, as if trying to break the coldness that had settled in the air. "Hi, I'm Sophie. These seats really are designed for paper people, not real humans." Marcus chuckled softly. "I'm Marcus, and I totally agree." That brief conversation, fleeting but warm, was the first light in the tunnel of pressure Marcus had just stepped into. He felt a little less small, but that warmth didn't last long. Caldwell returned to his seat, sitting down with a deep, loaded sigh, and immediately stretched his hand to claim most of the shared armrest between them. His hand was large, strong, firm, not to support, but to dominate. Marcus instinctively moved to withdraw his hand, as he had done many times before, but then he stopped. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Never apologize for being where you belong. And that seat? You've paid for it just like anyone else." Marcus placed his elbow back down, gently touching Caldwell's arm, but not yielding. No words were exchanged. But the tension was thick, like mist before a storm. While Sophie returned to her book, Marcus quickly pulled out his earbuds, intending to put on some music to block out the suffocating atmosphere. But just as he plugged in the wire, a light nudge from Caldwell's elbow pushed his hand aside. Not by accident, on purpose. "Sorry," Marcus said, automatically, like a survival reflex. Caldwell didn't respond, merely curling his lips slightly as though Marcus had just admitted to some pitiable mistake. That was the first step in the game of unspoken power. A game Marcus had played many times in his life, in classrooms, at science conferences, in the elevators of luxury hotels. A game where people like Caldwell always think they're the ones holding the rules, until the other side refuses to play by them. In the cabin, the flight attendants began the safety briefing. Everyone seemed barely focused, but Marcus, though his ears pretended to listen, felt more than ever the presence of another sound. The rustle of prejudice, the cracking of patience, and the deeper breaths of a boy trying to hold his composure amidst cold stares. The flight began like any other, but in row 16, an internal flight had silently taken off, heading towards confrontation, towards self-assertion, towards things no instruction manual could ever teach. And to Marcus's right, Warren Caldwell, his face still expressionless, had started studying Marcus more closely, as though waiting for him to make a mistake. Marcus quietly pulled out his phone and opened his presentation to review it one last time. But before he could even get to the third line, a small, folded piece of paper was suddenly pushed toward him from the left, from Sophie. It read, "The guy on your right seems like the life of every party, huh?" Marcus chuckled quietly, trying to stifle the sound. He pulled out a pen and wrote beneath it, a mix between a Bond villain and an ethics teacher. Sophie giggled softly, reaching out her hand. They exchanged pens, paper, and glances, things that, at 16, sometimes have more power than any smartphone. A few seats over, Caldwell glanced over, his eyes narrowing. He didn't say anything, but the way he stopped typing, rested his hand on his forehead, and sighed deliberately was an unmistakable message. "I don't like this happening next to me." But Marcus didn't stop. Sophie tilted her head toward him, quietly asking, "What are you doing in L.A.?" "The National Science Decathlon, Astrophysics, Gravitational Waves from Binary Black Holes." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Wow, I barely scraped through Physics 2, and this still sounds mind-blowing." "And you?" "Visiting my mom. My parents are divorced, and I'm the ping-pong ball between Atlanta and L.A. every summer." Marcus nodded, understanding. Two kids from two different worlds, both trying to rewrite their place between the tangled lines of family, society, and growing up. Caldwell reached for his earbuds. But instead of putting them on, he stared at Marcus, then turned to Sophie, pursing his lips and asking, "Are you two planning on talking the whole flight?" The question was like a cold splash of water. Sophie turned to him, offering a faint smile. "We'll keep our voices down, if it bothers you." "It does," Caldwell interrupted, his gaze cutting through the words. "Some of us need to focus on serious work." Marcus felt his cheek heat up, not out of embarrassment but from the simmering anger. Not because he was being asked to be silent, but because of the way it was being demanded. As if two kids, especially him, were an unnecessary nuisance. But once again, he swallowed his reaction as he had been taught. Calm, no confrontation. Not to be labeled as the angry black kid. Sophie, though, didn't. She raised an eyebrow. "We've been talking very quietly. You can use the headphones, or your ears. The choice is yours." Caldwell turned away, but from his eyes, Marcus knew. This conversation was far from over. A little while later, when the flight attendants passed by offering water, Sophie seized the opportunity to push another piece of paper toward Marcus. "This guy has CEO-level Karen energy." Marcus fought back a laugh. He quickly wrote back, "Prediction. He'll say, 'When I was younger, there were no privileges,' in the next 30 minutes. Sophie replied instantly, "Prepare for the tradition, values, work ethic speech. I've heard it from my uncle." The atmosphere in row 16 seemed light-hearted, but beneath the humor was a cold truth. Prejudice existed, not loud, but bleeding slowly. Marcus's presence, even without saying a provocative word, was enough to make Caldwell feel threatened. And the fact that he was chatting comfortably with a smart, funny white girl only made the layers of Caldwell's facade start to peel away. Marcus felt it in the way he shifted, claimed more of the seat space, staring at the tablet screen but not reading anything. But this time, Marcus didn't feel alone. Sophie, without needing to speak loudly or make any grand declarations, stood beside him with her mere presence, her warm smile, and by not turning away like so many others had. In that stuffy cabin, the first alliance had been formed. Not in loud cries, but in subtlety and quiet courage, and that would make the coming storm harder to crush him easily. The silence after Caldwell's sarcastic remarks didn't last long. Though no one spoke, the atmosphere in row 16 shifted from suffocating to tense, like a string pulled taut. A slight touch could snap everything apart. Amara Davis, the head flight attendant, was no stranger to situations like this. 11 years of working in the air had honed her sixth sense, the ability to hear what wasn't said, feel what wasn't acknowledged, and see what no one wanted to look at. From the galley in the front, as she pushed the drink cart down the aisle, she noticed the tension. The locked gazes, the stiff movements, the space between them stretched by an invisible force. No one was raising their voice, but the atmosphere in row 16 was distinctly different. Amara glanced at the small digital name tag on her tablet. 16B, Marcus Williams, 16 years old. 16C, Warren Caldwell, businessman. One look was enough to understand what was simmering beneath the surface. She'd seen it before. A black teenager, simply sitting in the wrong place in someone's eyes, becoming an annoying thorn for the rest of the flight. Amara approached with her professional smile, the same one she'd used 1,000 times before. "Everything okay, folks?" Caldwell looked up, his face shifting from cold to an unnervingly fake civility. "Oh, everything's fine. We just had a very lively conversation." Marcus nodded, his lips pressed tight, his eyes avoiding everyone. Sophie remained silent, her gaze fixed firmly on the open book in front of her, her hand gripping it tighter than usual. Amara didn't need a verbal answer. She just nodded slightly. "If you need anything, just press the call button. I'll be by regularly." As she continued pushing the cart, she glanced briefly at James, a white colleague who had been working with her for 6 years. "Row 16 is showing signs." "I've seen that kind before," James replied. "I'll check in when we hand out snacks." A quiet, smooth, and precise coordination. No need for records, no need for noise. But now, Marcus had someone silently standing on his side. At the back of the cabin, by the window seat in 23D, Michael Kavich, an elderly man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and experienced eyes, was also watching. Unlike the other passengers who were plugged into their headphones, asleep, or glued to their screens, Michael sat upright, his eyes quietly following everything from the moment they boarded. Not out of curiosity, but because he saw things that many others overlooked, because he had lived through them. He saw how Marcus lowered his head when Caldwell bumped his shoulder, how Caldwell shot him a cold look when Marcus smiled at Sophie, how the air subtly shifted around a young black man sitting in the middle of coach, as if the entire cabin order had been disrupted. Michael Kavich didn't know who Marcus was. He only knew that. The look in that young man's eyes reminded him of another look, from a man he owed his life to many years ago, in a tropical rainforest in 1975. And, if he wasn't mistaken, Marcus might be that man's grandson. The flight continued, quietly heading west. But beneath the smooth skies, beneath the steel shell and luxurious interiors, 3 layers of observation were converging. Caldwell, the man who still thought he was in control but was losing grip. Amara and James, the silent gatekeepers, safeguarding fairness with professional rules and sensitive hearts. And Michael Cavich, the one witnessing it all, saying nothing, but watching with a purpose no one yet understood. They didn't speak, they didn't signal, but each of them saw and remembered. Because some things, even when left unspoken, are still clearly present in the air, like a silent indictment of the injustice passed down through generations. The looks of understanding had left, but the feeling of being watched remained, silently, but burning like fire hidden under ash. After nearly an hour of suffocating silence, Caldwell suddenly turned to Marcus, starting with a seemingly harmless question. "Where are you headed, kid? Visiting family?" Marcus removed his earbuds, keeping his voice calm. "No, I'm participating in the National Science Decathlon, the national finals." Caldwell nodded, repeating, "Ah, decathlon, impressive." Then he paused for a moment, and it was there the mask began to crack. "When I was your age, there weren't any scholarships for anyone. Everything was based on merit, no preferences, no privileges." His voice was even, soft, like a casual cafe conversation, but each word he uttered felt like a velvet-covered needle, digging deep into the air between the 3 people sitting there. Marcus stared straight ahead, not looking back. His heart raced, but his voice remained steady. "I guess, back then, all exam rooms looked pretty much the same." Sophie looked up from her book. Her eyes gleamed with caution, but Caldwell just chuckled, as if Marcus had just made a funny joke. "You know," he continued, "today, people are so focused on diversity, race, gender, that they forget there are poor white people who have to work twice as hard. It's just that no one makes special programs for them." Caldwell's words were as sharp as a scalpel. Not direct, not harsh, but unmistakably, he was denying the existence of systemic injustice and subtly positioning himself as the forgotten victim in a society that was too woke. Marcus took a deep breath. Part of him wanted to ignore it, but another part, the part that was growing with each passing minute in the sky, couldn't stay silent anymore. "I understand how you feel, but the concept of fairness doesn't mean everyone starts at the same starting line. Fairness is when the starting line isn't pulled back because of skin color, gender, or geography." Caldwell chuckled, this time drier. "Sounds like a speech from a political science class. Where do you go to school? One of those fancy private schools with a diversity scholarship, huh?" Marcus turned toward him, their eyes locking. "I got into the school because of my grades, because of my essay, because of my interview. And if you think my skin color is a golden ticket, then maybe you don't understand the price someone like me has to pay to sit in this seat." The air thickened. No one argued, no one raised their voice, but the cabin seemed to cool a few degrees. Sophie put her book down, gently but decisively. "I think what Marcus just said is completely right. Actually, I think the affirmative action system has never been enough to make up for generations left behind. The people who are denied aren't because of their abilities, but because of their last names, their addresses, the color of their skin under the classroom lights." Caldwell looked at Sophie, his gaze faltering for a brief moment. Perhaps he hadn't expected a young white girl to stand up for the black kid sitting in the middle. "You're too young to understand that this world doesn't revolve around who gets treated unfairly anymore. Now it's about reverse retribution. People choose who has a story to tell, not who works the hardest." Marcus gripped the edge of his seat. That comment, an attempt to erase all of his genuine effort, and the efforts of countless black children in this country, was the kind of discrimination he hated the most. It didn't contain hate-filled words, but it distorted the truth. He lifted his head, his voice low but clear. Not every story is about being a victim. Some stories are the truth. And the more you deny it, the clearer it becomes that you're not willing to listen. Amara, standing off to the side, turned her head to look. Michael Cavich, in row 23, closed his eyes, but still heard every word. And Caldwell, in that moment, no longer smiled, no longer smirked, no longer took control. All that was left was a man who was feeling his power challenged for the first time. Not through rebellion, but through intellect. And that was what made him hate Marcus more than anything else. The silence after the sharp exchange, still controlled, left Marcus feeling as though his head were spinning. The fatigue crept through his muscles, not from the cabin pressure, but from the constant strain of maintaining composure, politeness, and dignity, like a bowstring stretched too long. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and allowed his body to temporarily sink into a fragile calm. His ears could still catch the hum of the engine, the soft whispers of those nearby, the faint hiss of wind brushing against the aircraft. But he couldn't hear Caldwell's voice. At least, not at that moment. 15 minutes later, Marcus awoke, sensing something odd in the air beside him. He cracked his eyes open and saw Caldwell leaning towards the aisle, speaking with the man in 17C, another white man, around Caldwell's age, casually dressed but still exuding a businessman's demeanor. "I'm telling you," Caldwell was saying, his voice not loud but clear. "Nowadays, if you're a straight white man working hard, congratulations, you're the one left behind." The man nodded, seemingly in agreement. "Exactly. My grandson came home from college talking about white privilege. Meanwhile, I grew up poor in Alabama, working on the farm from a young age." "What privilege?" Caldwell chuckled dismissively. "Exactly. They're teaching kids to be ashamed of their skin color. Collective guilt, woke culture. That's not progress, that's destroying traditional values." Marcus turned his face away, but every word felt like an arrow piercing through the shield of composure he had tried to build. No one pointed at him. No one mentioned his name, but he knew full well the conversation was revolving around his presence and Sophie's, a young girl daring to argue back, a black boy daring to be intelligent. Those words indirectly turned him into a threat, into the consequence of woke culture, into a living testament of an order being overturned. Sophie seemed to hear it too. She turned toward him, whispering, "Sounds like a secret conference of those protecting the pure Western way, huh?" Marcus tried to smile, but the smile barely touched his lips, like a broken ray of sunlight in the afternoon. The space in the cabin seemed to shrink, not because of the seats, but because of the atmosphere that had changed. Between the steady hum of the plane there were scattered murmurs full of implications, sidelong glances, brief glances that quickly turned away. A few passengers, not many but enough to notice, had begun to pay attention to row 16. They didn't intervene, but they observed. And, as always, they chose the safety of silence over the discomfort of intervention. Suddenly, Caldwell turned to Marcus, as if just realizing he had woken up. "Oh, you were asleep? I thought you were still reviewing your presentation, proving that gravity should be equal to." His tone was laced with sarcasm. He didn't need to shout, nor was he vulgar, but it was subtle enough that any reaction would easily be seen as too sensitive. Marcus looked up, meeting his gaze. His voice was low, clear, but definitely not loud. "I was trying to sleep. Could you save your arguments for your next LinkedIn group meeting?" For a moment, Caldwell froze. Then he chuckled, but this time the laughter lacked its usual mockery. It had a touch of discomfort, as if he realized this kid wasn't backing down anymore. He wasn't afraid. He turned back to his tablet, tapping the screen forcefully. But the words that scrambled across the screen couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. In row 23, Michael Cavich continued to observe. From Marcus's eyes, from Caldwell's forced laugh, from the deliberate but subtle shoulder bump as the flight attendant passed by. He knew the storm hadn't arrived yet, but the clouds had gathered, and when it broke, no one would be outside its reach. The ding signaling the plane had touched down rang out along with the familiar announcement from the captain. "We've just landed at Los Angeles International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until the plane has come to a complete stop at the gate." The passengers began to stir. The sound of seatbelts clicking open, bags being pulled from under seats, and in the heavy air of the cabin, everyone was eager to escape the flying metal box. Marcus leaned forward to grab his phone from his bag, preparing to text his dad that he had landed safely. As he moved his hand, he accidentally brushed his elbow against Caldwell's folding tray, where a half-finished paper cup of coffee and a glowing tablet were sitting. Just a slight touch, and a little coffee splashed, hitting the edge of the tablet. Caldwell shot up like a spring. "Look what you just did." He ground each word out, his voice echoing through the cabin, which had gone still in surprise. Marcus jumped, quickly reaching out to help wipe it off. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Let me—" "It's always, I didn't mean to, right? You're the type of person, always causing problems, and blaming it on circumstances." His eyes widened, his face flushed red. Passengers nearby began turning toward them. Sophie stopped texting and immediately looked up. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice not loud but clear. "It was just a small accident. No need to shout like that." Caldwell turned sharply, his eyes filled with fury, his white sclera visible. "Ah, I see. Now it's your turn to defend him. Another woke alliance. Let me guess. Next, it'll be the black victim, the kind-hearted white girl and the toxic white uncle. Did I get it right?" No one answered. But the atmosphere was changing, fast, clearly. "Enough," Sophie snapped back, no longer maintaining her calm. "This whole thing is on you. You're the one who invaded space, insulted and discriminated against him the entire flight. And now you're turning a small accident into an excuse to—" Caldwell shouted. "No more hiding anything. Don't play the race card with me." The sound tore through the cabin like thunder. A once quiet cabin full of people packing up suddenly froze. Those standing in the aisle stopped. Hands holding bags froze midway. Every eye turned toward row 16. Marcus sat still, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the edge of the seat. Not out of fear, but because he was holding back. The accusation, playing the race card, wasn't just a denial of pain, but a shove back to the place he had always been put. The troublemaker, the overly sensitive one, the unruly black child. Sophie stood up suddenly, her voice trembling with anger. "No one's playing any cards here. You're the one shouting in the plane. You're the one verbally abusing him from the start, and you're the one who can't stand that someone, especially a black student, can be smart, calm, and not afraid of you," Caldwell growled. "I'm tired of this society always blaming people like me. I have the right to react when I'm offended." In that moment, the space felt like it was falling into freefall. No one breathed, no one moved, and then a voice rang out, calm, professional, but as firm as steel. "That's enough, sir." Amara Davis had stepped forward, standing at the front of row 16. Her face was no longer that of a flight attendant. It was that of someone in full control of a critical situation. The flight has landed. Passengers are deplaning. If you continue causing disruption, we will have to call airport security to intervene. Caldwell turned to her, but in that moment he hesitated. Perhaps it was because Amara's gaze was not one of pleading for him to sit down. It was the gaze of someone who had dealt with people like him before, and was no longer patient. Marcus hadn't stood up yet. Sophie still stood beside him, her eyes full of fire. Caldwell clenched his fists, his face shifting colors, and in the silence that followed, a deeper crack had formed between that man and the rest of the world in the cabin. The mask had fallen, and that white hand, once used to controlling, occupying space, and commanding with words, was now trembling with anger, or perhaps with fear of something larger, losing power. The atmosphere seemed to have been under control when Amara spoke, but in a moment of confusion. As the footsteps of passengers continued, as Sophie was about to sit back down, everything shattered. Caldwell didn't say anything more. He suddenly leaned forward, extended his hand, and slapped Marcus hard across the face. The sound echoed like a whip cracking in the confined space. Marcus didn't have time to flinch. He didn't think it would escalate this far. The slap turned his face to the side. The earbuds fell to the floor, his left cheek burning as if someone had just pressed a hot iron to his skin. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He just sat still, back straight, eyes wide in shock. It was the silence that made the crowded cabin feel like it was in a vacuum. No one moved. No one spoke. The man, sitting in 17C, Caldwell's companion, gaped but didn't dare say a word. Sophie was stunned. She stood up again, but this time her hands shook, her lips stiff, unable to utter a single word. Amara took a step back, not out of fear, but to grab the emergency radio. Her voice was as sharp as a blade. "James, we have a physical assault. Call security immediately. Row 16. And then, with a single movement, the frozen atmosphere was shattered. Michael Cavich, from row 23, stepped forward. Not in a hurry, not shouting, but his thin, sturdy frame was as solid as an ancient beam that time hadn't worn down. When he reached them, he didn't ask anyone. He didn't ask for permission. He simply stepped between Caldwell and Marcus, his back to the young man, facing directly the one who had just struck him. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried farther than any announcement could. "You will not touch him again." Caldwell took a half step back, caught off guard by the intervention of a man he didn't recognize. "Who are you? This doesn't concern you." Michael didn't move. He didn't need to raise his voice, but his gaze, deep, bright, and as hard as tempered steel, made it clear that no one dared interrupt. "This concerns all of us," he said, each word heavy as stone. "When an adult attacks a child, when a white person behaves as though power is an inherent privilege, and when no one dares to stand up, then we all have a responsibility. I stand here to ensure that silence doesn't repeat itself." Caldwell stiffened. Not from the threat, but because in Michael's eyes he saw something he couldn't explain. Authority not from position, but from the silence that had gnawed at his conscience. And that was what made him afraid. Marcus still sat still, his hand touching his cheek, his eyes staring at the back of the older man standing in front of him. He didn't know who he was, but somehow he knew. His presence had changed everything. It was no longer about one person being humiliated. It was no longer about one slap. It was about an entire generation, a truth, a firm rejection of violence and prejudice. And for the first time since the plane had taken off, Caldwell stood speechless. No more excuses. All he had left was a trembling hand lowering, and an expression that no longer concealed his overwhelming confusion. In the silence, Dozens of passengers stood still as witnesses to a historic moment, where a black child was slapped but didn't fall, and where an old man stepped forward not out of obligation, but because his conscience had waited for this moment his whole life. Caldwell lowered his head, not out of regret, but because he had no more reason to look up. He hadn't expected that the slap he thought would be a punishment would turn out to be the final blow to the very moral mask he had worn his whole life. Meanwhile, Michael, still standing between Marcus and Caldwell, didn't take his eyes off the man who had just struck the boy, and with a voice steady and calm, he began to speak. Not with anger, but with a tone that felt heavy, as if telling something that had weighed on his heart for half a century. I've seen people like you many times, people who believe power is inherited, that social order is immutable, that skin color and money give them the right to speak, while others are only allowed to remain silent. In 1975, I was a young American soldier sent to Vietnam. I once witnessed a fellow soldier, a black man, being scolded and insulted by a superior officer right in the barracks. And I didn't speak up. The cabin was silent. Amara stood behind, and James had just appeared from the back of the cabin. No one interrupted. I didn't speak up because I was afraid. I thought, if it's not happening to me, then it's best not to get involved. I thought that silence was a way to survive, but I was wrong. I survived, but that friend of mine, James Henderson, did not. The name made Marcus look up. He furrowed his brow. James Henderson is your grandfather? Marcus softly asked. Michael nodded slightly, his eyes wet but still firm as he looked into the past. He saved my life, Marcus. During an ambush, he shoved me into a foxhole when a grenade exploded right behind me. He lost blood and didn't get medical help in time. And I never told anyone that he had been discriminated against by an officer, that he was denied medical care just because he was black. I lived with that shame for 45 years. I stayed silent to protect my career, my family, my normal life. But the price of that normalcy was a debt, not to the dead, but to those who live on. Michael turned to Marcus. His voice trembled, not out of fear, but because the truth was finally being set free. I don't know if your grandfather ever told you this, but when I saw you get on the plane with that look in your eyes, the same look James had all those years ago, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I didn't stand up just to protect a boy who was slapped. I stood up to give back the voice I should have given to your grandfather back in 1975. Marcus looked at him. His eyes were red. Not just because of the slap, but because Michael's words had opened an unexpected connection. Between the present and the past, between blood and history, between a child learning to grow, and an old man trying to forgive himself. Caldwell still stood there, but he was almost invisible. In this moment, the lights revealed who truly had power, and who only lived off a system of privilege without ever asking who they were hurting. Michael stepped back, turning fully to Marcus for the first time, placing a hand on his shoulder. Today, you didn't just keep your dignity. You've preserved the dignity of a memory I thought I had lost. Outside the cabin, airport security was waiting. Amara turned, nodding slightly. James, her colleague, stepped forward to help Caldwell gather his belongings, but he stood frozen, as if gravity had doubled around him. No one needed to shout. No one needed to call his name anymore, because everyone had seen, with their eyes, with their ears, and with their hearts, what had just happened, and that would not be forgotten. The plane came to a stop. The door opened. A chapter had just ended, but for Michael and Marcus, the real chapter had only just begun. When the security officers entered the cabin in their blue uniforms and stern demeanor, Warren Caldwell said nothing more. He didn't resist. He didn't offer any excuses. There were no pleading or remorseful looks. Just the blank face of a man who had just realized that the world he had once believed was solid was now crumbling beneath his feet. A passenger nearby, no one knew who, had captured the entire incident on their phone. The video, just over 2 minutes long, from the slap to the moment Michael stood up, was enough to spark a wildfire on social media. Caldwell was immediately banned from flying indefinitely by the airline, a decision made just hours after the video reached 500,000 shares. The company he worked for, a global financial corporation, issued an internal statement. "We are reviewing Mr. Caldwell's off-duty conduct and its impact on the company's image." Within less than a day, the man who once sat upright as if he owned the world became a symbol of something that society no longer accepted: arrogance cloaked in a suit and power. In another part of the airport, Marcus, Michael, and Sophie sat in a separate waiting room where security officers took their statements. Marcus sat quietly, his head slightly bowed, hands clasped together. No one touched the red mark on his cheek. It was still there, clear, but the internal wound was what really exhausted him. A young officer approached and gently placed a statement form and a notice in front of him. "Since you are a minor, we need you to confirm whether you wish to file an official lawsuit. You may consult with a guardian or an attorney or take your time. No need to decide right away." Marcus nodded, speaking softly. "Thank you." As the officer walked away, Michael turned to him, his gaze not pushing but full of concern. "You're torn, aren't you?" Marcus nodded. "I don't know. Part of me wants to take it all the way, but part of me just wants to leave it behind, focus on the competition, on the future. If I sue, this will follow me forever. The media, interviews, social media. But if I don't, will he really face consequences?" Michael was silent for a long moment. The fluorescent lights reflected off his wrinkled forehead. Once, at a justice seminar, someone asked, "Is justice punishment, or is it healing?" I don't have a clear answer, but I learned one thing. Justice doesn't always come from the court. It comes from what's in a person's heart when their actions align with their conscience. If you sue, it has to be for yourself, not because someone else demands it. If you don't, it has to be because you've forgiven, not because you've given up. Marcus remained silent. He looked at Sophie, who had been there the whole time, unwavering, never bowing to the wrongs. He looked at Michael, a man who had spent his life seeking a moment to stand up and had found it today. And finally, he looked at himself, the son of an FAA leader who had always been taught that sometimes silence is wise, but there are times when one must speak so that others know you are living, not just existing. "I need one night to think," Marcus said softly. "Exactly," Michael smiled. "And you have every right to do that without feeling pressured by anyone." That night, as the news spread across social media and Warren Caldwell's name appeared on every headline, Marcus sat alone by the hotel window, looking out at the bright lights of Los Angeles. He didn't know what he would choose tomorrow, but he knew one thing. Today, he didn't bow his head, and whether he sued or not, that, for him, was already part of the victory. The morning after, the sky in Los Angeles remained as clear as if nothing had happened. But for Marcus, the world no longer felt the same. As he stepped out of the hotel to head to the competition venue, a light breeze brushed against his left cheek, where the warmth from yesterday's slap still lingered. But the feeling that accompanied the breeze was no longer humiliation. It was memory. It was a warning, and it was a reminder that he had stood firm. The night before leaving the airport, Michael had handed Marcus a small business card, the paper worn, but the writing still sharp. Michael Cavich, carpenter, direct contact. No logo, no title, no social media. Just a name, a trade, and a gaze that had lived through enough right and wrong to understand what truly mattered. "When you're ready," he had said, "call me. There's a story you need to hear. Not because I want to tell it, but because you need to hear it. The story of your grandfather. And of me." Marcus nodded, not promising, but not refusing either. Because he knew, somehow, an invisible connection had been awakened. Not with words, but through actions. On the bus taking the competitors to the venue, Marcus sat by the window. In his hands was the presentation about gravitational waves and binary black hole collisions, a complex scientific topic. But in his mind, he was thinking about entirely different collisions. Between generations, between prejudice and courage, between the past that hadn't closed and the future that was unfolding. Sophie sat beside him, not speaking much. But before stepping off the bus, she gently held his hand, giving it a soft squeeze. "Whatever happens in the competition, or whether you choose to sue him or not, you've already won the moment you didn't bow your head." Marcus looked at her, then nodded slightly. "You too. Thank you for not staying silent." The competition went smoothly. He presented clearly, coherently. And when the judges asked about the connection between physics and society, something unexpected happened. Marcus didn't avoid the question. He didn't tell the story of the plane incident, didn't mention anyone's name. But he spoke of collisions that cannot be measured by machines, but are strong enough to change the trajectory of a person. That afternoon, when the competition ended, Marcus took the business card from his jacket pocket and dialed the number. Michael picked up after 3 rings. "It's me, Marcus. I'm waiting. Are you free?" Alive and free to say what should have been said a long time ago. They met at a small cafe near Venice Beach. No frills, not crowded. Marcus arrived first. Michael arrived later, with a thin envelope in hand. "Inside is a letter your grandfather wrote to me in 1976, but I never answered." Marcus took it, not opening it right away. Michael looked out the window, where the sunset was slowly turning the sea red. "There are debts you don't pay with money, but with actions. Yesterday, I didn't stand up just for you. I stood up to be worthy of your grandfather's life-saving act. And today, I'm telling you this, to close a chapter of history. But you, yourself, are the one who will decide to open a new one." Outside, the ocean still crashed with waves, as if it had never known slaps, silence, or human pain. But in that moment, between a man who had stayed silent for 45 years and a boy who had just learned to speak, one thing had changed forever: the continuation. No one gets to choose when they are born. No one can undo the mistakes of the previous generation, but anyone can become the one to stand up when their turn comes. As Marcus left the cafe, the business card was still in his jacket pocket, but now it was no longer the promise of an old man, but a certification from a new generation. Ready to live, ready to speak, ready to move forward. Not because of the past, but because the future needs people who dare to stand up. In an airplane above the clouds, one slap revealed the deepest layers of prejudice. But it was also there that courage overcame anger, intellect overcame arrogance, and a man who had stayed silent for 45 years chose to stand up to protect a new generation. The story of Marcus and Michael wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reminder that justice doesn't come from the loudest screams, but from the right actions at the right moment. So, what about you? If you were sitting in that airplane cabin, would you stay silent or would you stand up? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice. If this story touched you, hit like, share to spread the value, And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss inspiring, real-life stories like this. Because sometimes it only takes one person to stand up. And that's enough to change everything. See you in the next video.